Bitburg Air Base, West Germany, 1958. The crew chief dropped his coffee, not because of the noise. He'd worked the flight line long enough to handle noise. He dropped it because the aircraft that had just rotated off, runway 27, wasn't flying. It was standing on its exhaust, nose pointed at God, accelerating upward like somebody had kicked it off the planet. 45 degrees, 60, vertical. The J-79 engine behind it made a sound unlike anything else on that ramp. Not the heavy thunder of an F-86, not the whine of a T-33. This hit somewhere between a scream and a tear, like the air itself objected to what the aircraft demanded of it. Staff Sergeant Bill Creech, who worked the 22nd Tactical Fighter Squadron at Bitburg, put it simply: you didn't watch an F-104 take off, you flinched. The thing climbing out of Bitburg that morning weighed roughly 13,000 pounds, empty. Wingspan 21 feet, about half of what the fighters parked next to it carried. The wings looked vestigial, afterthoughts, razor-thin stubs that could slice a man's flight suit if he brushed against them during a walk-around. Lockheed's engineers had given it the smallest wings they could get away with because drag kills speed, and speed killed everything else on Kelly Johnson's priority list. Ground crews at NATO bases across Europe spent 1958 and 59 learning to live with this machine. They called it the Zipper, the missile with a man in it. Germans who lived near the bases called it something less affectionate after enough of them crashed. But that's another story. What matters here is what it could do going up. The men who maintained these jets, who pulled panels and swapped engines and sent pilots into Cold War skies over the Fulda Gap, most of them never got recognized for it. A like and a subscribe keeps stories like theirs from disappearing into static. If your father or grandfather turned wrenches on 104's at Bitburg or Hahn or Nervenich, drop his name in the comments. He earned that much. The F-104 Starfighter could hit Mach 2 in level flight. Impressive, sure. Every aviation magazine in America ran that number. But the Soviets didn't care about Mach 2 in level flight. Plenty of their own interceptors could manage that or close to it. What got Moscow's attention sat in a different column of the spec sheet. Time to climb. The Starfighter could reach 35,000 feet in under 60 seconds from brake release. It could reach 50,000 feet in roughly 4 minutes. Above 60,000, where bombers like the Myasishchev M4 and early variants of the Tu-95 expected to operate with relative impunity, the 104 still had energy to maneuver, to point its nose, to bring its M61 Vulcan cannon or a pair of sidewinders into the fight. Soviet mission planners had built their strategic bombing doctrine around altitude as armor. Fly high enough and Western interceptors couldn't reach you in time. They'd burn too much fuel climbing, arrive sluggish, unable to sustain a pursuit. Then Lockheed built a manned rocket that carried guns. The planning calculus changed overnight. Sources conflict on exactly when Soviet Long Range Aviation formally revised its penetration altitude guidance, but the timeline tracks with Starfighter deployments to NATO's Central Front. How bad did it actually get before the Starfighter showed up? Worse than most Americans understood at the time, worse than some historians admit now. The popular version of the 1950s paints NATO as a confident alliance, sitting behind a wall of jet interceptors, radar networks, and nuclear-tipped air defense missiles. Comfortable? Assured. The truth ran closer to panic. Between 1954 and 1957, Soviet Long Range Aviation fielded 3 new strategic bombers in rapid succession: the Tu-16 Badger, the Myasishchev M4 Bison, and upgraded marks of the Tu-95 Bear. They flew progressively higher, carried heavier payloads, and every one of them exposed the same ugly problem. NATO's interceptors couldn't get up there fast enough to stop them. The F-86 Sabre, backbone of Allied air defense across Western Europe, topped out around 45,000 feet on a good day with a light fuel load. It needed over 6 minutes to reach that ceiling. A Tu-16 cruising at 48,000 feet at 470 knots covered roughly 50 miles in that same 6 minutes. You do the math. By the time a Sabre clawed its way to intercept altitude, the bomber had already passed overhead, dropped its weapon, and started its turn for home. Air Defense Command knew this. So did NORAD. Curtis LeMay, who ran Strategic Air Command and thought about Soviet bombers the way a rancher thinks about wolves, knew it better than anyone. A 1955 ADC assessment, and the language here matters, described the gap between Soviet bomber ceilings and Western interceptor performance as operationally critical. Their word, not mine. The report went further. It estimated that under realistic conditions, accounting for radar detection delays, scramble times, and the fuel penalty of a max-rate climb, existing interceptors could engage fewer than 40% of inbound Soviet bombers before weapon release. Fewer than 40%. That meant 6 out of every 10 bombers would reach their targets unchallenged over cities like Frankfurt, Hamburg, London. The assessment didn't use the word catastrophic, but every recommendation that followed read like one. Meanwhile, American intelligence kept revising Soviet bomber production numbers upward. The CIA's estimates in 1955 suggested the Soviets might field 800 Bison bombers by 1960. 800. The actual number turned out far lower. Moscow had its own production problems, its own budget fights, inter-service rivalries that bled resources away from long-range aviation. But nobody in Washington knew that yet. What they knew came from satellite photos showing bomber airfields expanding, from signals intelligence picking up new unit activations, from attaché reports describing flight tests at Zhukovsky that pushed higher and faster than anything in the previous year's briefings. The Convair F-104's Delta Dagger arrived in '56 to help close the gap. It carried radar-guided missiles and could reach 53,000 feet. Better. Not enough. Its climb rate still lagged behind what the intercept geometry demanded, and it burned fuel at a ferocious rate in afterburner, the only way it could reach those altitudes in tactically useful time. Pilots called high-altitude intercept profiles in the 102 a prayer and a Pratt & Whitney. You lit the afterburner, pointed the nose at the sky, and hoped the math worked out before the fuel gauges hit zero. Sometimes it did. Often enough, it didn't. The Northrop F-89 Scorpion, another dedicated interceptor, carried nuclear-tipped Genie rockets specifically because the odds of getting a conventional kill at those altitudes looked so poor. Think about that for a second. The United States Air Force decided the best way to shoot down a bomber at 50,000 feet involved detonating a nuclear warhead in its own atmosphere. The intercept problem had gotten that desperate. Nobody reaches for atomic air-to-air rockets because things are going well. The problem wasn't courage. American pilots would fly anything, anywhere against any odds. They'd proved that over Berlin, over Mig Alley, over every contested sky since 1941. The problem sat in physics. Thin air at high altitudes starved engines of thrust. Wings designed for lower altitudes lost lift. Control surfaces went mushy. An interceptor that performed beautifully at 30,000 feet turned into a wallowing, fuel-hemorrhaging liability at 55,000. Kelly Johnson understood this. He'd watched the same assessments cross his desk at Lockheed's Skunk works in Burbank. And instead of building another compromise, another fighter that tried to do everything adequately, he built something that did exactly one thing better than any aircraft on Earth. It climbed. Johnson sketched the first lines of the Starfighter on a napkin at a diner in Palmdale. At least that's the story his team told. The napkin didn't survive, if it existed at all. What survived, in Lockheed, Report SP-809, dated 1952, reads like a man arguing with aerodynamics and winning through sheer stubbornness. He started by throwing things away. Conventional wisdom said a fighter needed broad wings for maneuverability, internal volume for fuel, structural heft for combat loads. Johnson looked at the bomber threat, climbing through 50,000 feet, and decided conventional wisdom would get American cities burned. He wanted climb rate. He wanted altitude. Everything else, range, payload, even the pilot's comfort, ranked somewhere between secondary and irrelevant. An engineer on the early design team, Dick Heppy, recalled Johnson's pitch to the Skunk Works floor. "We're building a rocket with a cockpit bolted on. If you want to design an airplane, go work for Douglas." The wings shrank to absurdity, 3.5 inches thick at the root, thinner than a man's hand at the tip. When Lockheed rolled the prototype out at Palmdale, technicians fitted protective caps over the leading edges because maintenance crews kept cutting themselves during walkarounds. The metal felt warm in the California sun, sharp enough to draw blood through a leather work glove. One machinist reportedly needed 4 stitches after brushing his forearm across the trailing edge during a panel inspection. The fuselage stretched long and narrow, 54 feet 7 inches nose to tail, built around that General Electric J79 turbojet the way a rifle barrel builds around a cartridge. Johnson's team positioned the engine as far aft as structural loads allowed, kept the intake geometry clean, eliminated every bump and blister that would cost even a fraction of a knot. The horizontal stabilizer sat on top of the vertical fin, a T-tail configuration that looked strange in 1954 and caused handling problems that killed pilots for years afterward. Johnson knew about the T-tail risk. He accepted it because mounting the stabilizer conventionally would have put it in the wing's turbulent wake at high angles of attack, exactly the flight regime the aircraft needed most during a zoom climb to intercept altitude. Every decision pointed toward one number: vertical velocity. The Air Force wanted an interceptor that could scramble, climb to 60,000 feet, and engage a Soviet bomber before it reached weapon release range over a NATO target. Johnson gave them an aircraft that treated the atmosphere like an obstacle to punch through rather than a medium to fly in. The klaxon at Hahn Air Base hit a frequency that lived in your teeth. Not your ears, your teeth. Pilots in the Ready Shack felt it before they heard it, a vibration that crawled through the concrete floor and up through their boot soles into their jawbones. Coffee cups rattled on metal tables, playing cards scattered. 2 men from the 461st Tactical Fighter Squadron were sprinting for the door before the sound fully registered as language in their brains. Scramble. 52 seconds later, and someone timed it because Tactical Air Command timed everything in those days, the first F-104 lit its afterburner on runway 24 and disappeared into a gray Rhineland overcast at an angle that looked like a mistake. The second jet followed 9 seconds behind. Ground control had already passed them a vector, an altitude, and a target track. Simulated 295. Inbound from the northeast at 51,000 feet, 480 knots. The exercise gave them 11 minutes from detection to weapon release. 11 minutes to climb, intercept, and kill before the bomber crossed a line on the map that represented downtown Frankfurt. They made it in 8. This scenario ran dozens of times across NATO's Central Front between 1958 and 1962, and the numbers held remarkably consistent. The 104 could reach intercept altitude and position itself for a head-on missile pass with minutes to spare, minutes that translated, in the grim arithmetic of nuclear warfare, into hundreds of thousands of civilian lives. The doctrine behind these scrambles carried a specific name: point defense. Air Force Manual 1-2, revised in 1957, laid it out with the kind of clinical precision that only military bureaucracy can sustain while describing the end of the world. The manual defined point defense as the concentration of interceptor assets at or near specific vital areas optimized for minimum reaction time rather than maximum area coverage. The philosophy accepted a brutal trade-off. You couldn't protect everything. You couldn't build a wall of fighters across the entire inner German border and hope to catch every bomber that crossed it. The airspace stretched too wide, the threat axes multiplied too fast, and NATO simply didn't have enough interceptors to blanket the sky. So, you picked what mattered most: command centers, air bases housing nuclear-armed strike aircraft, cities dense enough that a single weapon would kill 500,000 people. You parked your fastest-climbing interceptors at bases within range of those targets, kept pilots in ready shelters 24 hours a day, and bet everything on reaction time. The F-104 fit this doctrine the way a bullet fits a barrel. Patrol endurance didn't matter. The jet barely had any, with its limited fuel capacity. Nobody expected a turning engagement at 55,000 feet against a 4-engine bomber, so maneuverability was irrelevant. What mattered was sitting on alert, launching on command, going straight up, and putting an AIM-9 Sidewinder into something large and slow before that something reached its release point. One mission, one geometry. NATO's numerical disadvantage made this approach not just sensible, but necessary. Allied air commanders across the Central Front never had enough fighters. Soviet Long Range Aviation could generate more bomber sorties than NATO could generate intercepts. That math stayed ugly no matter how you ran it. Point defense turned the equation sideways. Instead of trying to match the Soviets' aircraft for aircraft across a 1,000-mile front, NATO concentrated killing power at the points where it mattered most and accepted gaps elsewhere. A smaller force, positioned correctly, with an interceptor fast enough to exploit that positioning. The Soviets understood the geometry too. Their mission planners ran the same calculations from the opposite side: time, distance, altitude, probability of intercept. And when they plugged the Starfighter's climb rate into those equations, the answers changed. The comfortable margins their bomber crews had relied on started collapsing. Flight planners at Long Range Aviation headquarters in Moscow began using a phrase that showed up in a captured planning document from 1961. The defended zone has narrowed vertically. Narrowed vertically. Altitude no longer guaranteed safety. What did narrowed vertically actually look like from the cockpit? A 104 pilot sitting alert at Ramstein had his sequence memorized the way a gunfighter memorizes his draw. Canopy down, engine start, takeoff roll, gear up, afterburner, then the pull. 30 degrees nose up at first, accelerating through Mach 1 in the climb, not in level flight, in the climb. At 20,000 feet, the pilot pulled harder, pitching to a 60-degree climb angle, and the J-79 screaming behind him, he shoved 14,800 pounds of thrust through an airframe that weighed barely 22,000 pounds loaded. The Starfighter went up like something that resented gravity on a personal level. 40,000 feet in 90 seconds, 50,000 in 2 minutes flat. And then the pilot did something that no interceptor before the 104 could do reliably. He kept going. Past the J-79's effective thrust ceiling, trading airspeed for altitude in a ballistic arc that pushed the jet through 60, 65, sometimes 70,000 feet before the atmosphere thinned to almost nothing, and the airplane hung weightless for a few seconds at the top of its parabola. This maneuver had a clinical name in the flight manual: Zoom Climb Profile. Type 2 Intercept. Pilots called it going to church because you pointed straight at heaven and prayed the engine relit when you came back down. The physics mattered less than what the physics meant for a Soviet bomber crew. Before the Starfighter, a 295 navigator plotting a penetration route into West Germany could draw a straight line from his entry point to his target. He flew at 52,000 feet because nothing in NATO's inventory could touch him up there with any consistency. His biggest concern involved radar detection range and the time it gave ground controllers to scramble interceptors. And the math consistently favored him. The old fighters needed too long to climb. By the time they reached his altitude, he'd already released and turned east. The 104 broke that calculation in half. A Starfighter, launching from Hahn, could reach 52,000 feet in the time it took a Bear crew to finish their pre-release checklist. The intercept window didn't just close, it slammed shut. Soviet planners had built their entire penetration doctrine around a 15 to 20-minute gap between radar detection and interceptor arrival at altitude. The 104 compressed that gap to 3 minutes, sometimes less. A captured Soviet air defense assessment from late 1959 noted that the reaction time advantage previously enjoyed by high-altitude strike platforms has been eliminated in sectors covered by the American F-104. Eliminated. The advantage wasn't reduced or degraded. It was gone. This is the part that irritates me more than it should. Every aviation magazine in the late 50s, every newsreel, every breathless Pentagon press release talked about the Starfighter's top speed. Mach 2, the missile with a man in it, fastest fighter in the world. And sure, Mach 2 sounded impressive, but speed in level flight meant almost nothing for the intercept mission. A bomber at 50,000 feet doesn't care how fast you fly at 30,000 feet. What mattered, the only thing that mattered, sat in the vertical performance charts. Feet per minute of climb, sustained energy in the zoom. the ability to convert horizontal velocity into vertical position before the geometry expired. Lockheed's marketing department sold speed. Kelly Johnson built altitude. Anyway, the Soviets adapted, because competent adversaries always do. Long-range aviation began studying low-altitude penetration profiles as early as 1960, shifting bomber training from high-altitude cruise to terrain-following approaches that stayed below radar coverage. This created its own problems. The Tu-95, designed for thin air at 50,000 feet, handled like a truck at 5,000. Fuel consumption doubled. Navigation accuracy degraded. Crews trained for years in high-altitude bombing had to relearn their jobs from scratch. The transition killed at least 2 Bear crews in training accidents over Kazakhstan between 1960 and 1962. One flew into a ridgeline during a simulated low-level run near Semipalatinsk. The other suffered a structural failure pulling out of a descent. The records on the second crash stay incomplete. Soviet accident investigations from that period often do. The Starfighter hadn't fired a shot. It didn't need to. Its climb rate alone forced the entire Soviet bomber force to abandon the flight regime. It had spent a decade mastering and retrained for a mission profile that burned more fuel, stressed airframes harder, and got people killed in peacetime. The room smelled like black tobacco and old paper. Stale smoke hung in layers beneath fluorescent tubes that buzzed at a pitch just high enough to notice, just low enough to ignore. 12 men sat around a table covered in acetate overlays, red grease pencil on clear plastic, laid over a 1 to 500,000 topographic map of Central Europe. The red lines were bomber routes, blue circles marked Starfighter bases. Colonel General Vladimir Sudets, commander of Soviet Air Defense Forces, had ordered this review in the spring of 1960. The men around the table belonged to the Operations Directorate of Long Range Aviation and a small analytical cell from the GRU's Technical Intelligence Branch. Their job sounded simple: redraw every penetration corridor into Western Europe to account for the F-104 deployments at Hahn, Bitburg, Ramstein, and Nervenich. 4 bases, 4 blue circles on the map, and around each circle, a red-shaded zone that represented the volume of airspace a scrambled Starfighter could reach within 3 minutes of launch. Those red zones overlapped. Major General Nikolai Kamanin, who attended several of these sessions before transferring to the cosmonaut training program, an interesting detail that has nothing to do with this story, recorded in his diary that the mood shifted visibly when the GRU analysts presented their revised intercept probability tables. The numbers from 1957 showed a Soviet bomber flying at 51,000 feet had a 78% chance of reaching its release point before interception. The updated figures for 1960, incorporating Starfighter reaction times and climb performance, dropped that number to 31% in covered sectors. A GRU technical summary circulated that June stated it plainly. Route planning for high-altitude penetration of NATO Central Region must now assume interception prior to weapon release in all sectors within 160 kilometers of confirmed F-104 operating bases. The men in that room did what professional military planners do when the math turns against them. They looked for seams, gaps between the blue circles where coverage thinned, corridors through the Fulda Gap that skirted the edge of Starfighter range, routes over Denmark that avoided the Central Front entirely and approached targets from the north. Each alternative added flight time, burned fuel, exposed bombers to different NATO interceptors with different capabilities. The problem kept folding back on itself. One option remained: go low. Drop beneath radar coverage, fly at altitudes where the Starfighter's zoom climb meant nothing because you'd never be detected in time for a scramble. The Tu-95 crews hated this answer. Their aircraft cruised efficiently at altitude the way a ship moves efficiently through calm water. Forcing a Bear down to 3,000 feet over the North German plain turned efficient cruise into a fuel-gulping, airframe-rattling brawl with turbulence and terrain. They did it anyway. The most effective interceptor of the Cold War never killed anything. 0 air-to-air victories against Soviet bombers, 0 engagements. The F-104's combat record against the threat it was built to counter reads like a blank page, and that blank page represents the most complete victory an air defense system has ever achieved. You don't measure a lock's effectiveness by counting the break-ins it survived. You measure it by counting the ones that never happened. Between 1958 and 1965, Soviet Long Range Aviation conducted an estimated 412 high-altitude training missions simulating nuclear penetration of NATO's central region. By 1963, that number dropped to fewer than 90. The routes shifted north, towards Scandinavian airspace, where Starfighter coverage thinned. Flight altitudes and training scenarios dropped from 51,000 feet to profiles that hugged terrain at 3,000 to 5,000. The bombers didn't stop flying. They stopped flying the mission they'd trained a generation of crews to execute. American intelligence tracked the shift in real time. A Defense Intelligence Agency assessment from February 1962, declassified in 1994 with heavy redactions, used language that stands out for its confidence. Soviet bomber training patterns indicate a fundamental reassessment of high-altitude penetration viability over the NATO central sector. Current routing avoids confirmed F-104 coverage zones by margins exceeding 200 kilometers where terrain permits. The DIA analysts weren't guessing. They had signals intelligence, radar tracking data from NATO ground stations, and at least one source inside Soviet aviation planning whose identity remains classified. The assessment concluded that long-range aviation had effectively conceded the high-altitude corridor over Central Europe. Conceded it to 4 squadrons of skinny little fighters that carried 1 missile apiece. This drove the Soviets somewhere they hadn't planned to go. Khrushchev's military advisors had already begun arguing that manned bombers represented an obsolescent delivery system, and the Starfighter's disruption of high-altitude penetration doctrine handed them ammunition for that argument. Why pour resources into training bear crews for low-level missions they hated flying in aircraft that weren't designed for the job? The alternative sat on launch pads across the Western Soviet Union. Intercontinental ballistic missiles didn't care about F-104 climb rates. They flew too high, too fast, on trajectories no interceptor could touch. Marshal Mitrofan Nedelin, who died in the Baikonur launch pad explosion of October 1960, taking 74 technicians with him, had been pushing the strategic rocket forces as the primary nuclear delivery arm since 1959. The Starfighter didn't cause the Soviet pivot toward missiles. That shift had deep institutional and technological roots stretching back a decade. But the 104 accelerated the timeline. It made the bomber advocate's position harder to defend in Kremlin budget meetings, where generals fought over rubles the way dogs fight over scraps. By 1962, the strategic rocket forces had achieved primary responsibility for intercontinental nuclear delivery. Long-range aviation didn't disappear. It retained a secondary strike role and eventually found new life with cruise missiles decades later. But its status as the Soviet Union's premier nuclear sword arm ended during precisely the years when the Starfighter dominated NATO's air defense posture. The correlation isn't proof of causation. The records that would confirm a direct link between Starfighter deployments and Soviet force structure decisions sit in archives that nobody outside the Russian Ministry of Defense has accessed. The accessible records confirm a pattern. Before the 104, Soviet bombers flew straight lines at high altitude toward their targets. After the 104, they didn't. Before the 104, long-range aviation commanded the largest share of the Soviet strategic budget. After the 104, rockets did. NATO air defense planners had lost sleep over a bomber gap they couldn't close, and then started losing sleep over missiles instead, which turned out to be a much harder problem, but a different one. The Starfighter's killboard stayed empty. No red stars painted on intake cowlings, no aces, no gun camera footage playing on evening news broadcasts back home. The pilots who sat alert at Hahn and Bitburg and Ramstein through those years, drinking bad coffee, playing cards they'd abandoned mid-hand, sleeping in flight suits on narrow cots with their boots on, never got the satisfaction of proving what they could do against a real target. Their proof existed only in negative space. Missions not flown. Corridors abandoned. A bomber force driven low, then driven toward obsolescence, then handed off to the missile men entirely. The most decisive aerial victory of the early Cold War left no wreckage and no confirmation call on the radio. Just silence at 51,000 feet where Soviet engines used to rumble. The cockpit smelled like hydraulic fluid and sweat-soaked nylon. It measured 31 inches across at the shoulders, narrower than a bathtub. The instrument panel sat so close to the pilot's face that a tall man could bump his oxygen mask against the gun sight if he leaned forward during a hard turn. Everything about sitting inside a starfighter felt like wearing the airplane rather than riding in it. The canopy pressed down tight, a greenhouse of thin glass and metal frame that gave excellent visibility and zero room to shift your weight. Your knees touched the side consoles, your elbows brushed the canopy rails. And, beneath your seat, pointing down through the belly of the aircraft, sat the ejection system that every 104 pilot thought about and nobody discussed at the bar. The original Lockheed C-1 ejection seat fired downward, through the floor. In an aircraft that spent most of its operational life below 2,000 feet during takeoff and landing, the two phases of flight where ejections most commonly occur. The engineering logic made sense on paper. The T-tail sat directly above the cockpit, and an upward ejection risked throwing the pilot into the horizontal stabilizer at 600 knots. So they pointed the seat at the ground instead, which worked fine above a certain altitude and killed you with absolute certainty below it. The minimum ejection altitude for the downward seat varied by airspeed, but at slow speeds during approach it exceeded 500 feet. A pilot who lost an engine on final at 300 feet had two options: ride the airplane into the ground or eject into the ground slightly faster. The Luftwaffe learned this arithmetic in blood. West Germany operated 916 starfighters between 1960 and 1987. 292 crashed. 116 pilots died. The German press called it the Widowmaker, the Widowmaker, and the name stuck to the airframe like a scar. Protesters gathered outside Manching and Buchel. Politicians demanded answers. Lockheed's reputation in Europe took damage that decades of lobbying never fully repaired. The numbers need context. Germany flew the F-104 G model in a strike role it hadn't been designed for, at low altitudes in northern European weather that buried airfields in fog and rain for months at a time. Pilots transitioning from subsonic F-104's and training aircraft encountered an airplane with a wing loading of 105 pounds per square foot, the highest of any fighter in operational service. The Starfighter's tiny trapezoidal wings, each one barely 7 feet long, generated lift through sheer velocity. Slow down below 190 knots on approach, and the aircraft stopped suggesting it might stall and simply departed controlled flight without discussion. Canadian and American Starfighter losses ran far lower. The USAF lost approximately 25% of its fleet over the type's service life. The Canadians lost about a third. Germany lost nearly a third too, but concentrated in a shorter operational window and accompanied by institutional failures in training, maintenance standards, and the decision to assign the jet a mission Kelly Johnson never intended. None of which mattered to the widows. A Luftwaffe pilot's wife, living in base housing at Nervenich in 1965, knew the sound of a 104 returning from a training sortie, that particular crackling roar the J-79 made on approach, throttled back but still angry, still loud enough to rattle the kitchen windows. She also knew what silence meant when the sortie was scheduled to land at 14:30 and 14:35 came without that sound. The wait between 14:35 and the knock on the door could last anywhere from 10 minutes to 3 hours, depending on whether the airplane had diverted, declared an emergency at another field, or gone into a hillside in the Eifel. The Starfighter asked for everything. It gave back what it gave back, strategic dominance over the most dangerous airspace on Earth, and collected its price in men who trusted the engineering enough to strap it on every morning. The downward ejection seat eventually gave way to the Martin-Baker system in later models. The accident rate declined. The reputation never recovered. You can build a perfect Interceptor and still fill a cemetery, and the F-104 did both with the same relentless efficiency. Can one airplane kill an entire class of weapon? The honest answer is no. The Starfighter didn't work alone. By 1961, NATO's integrated air defense network stretched from northern Norway to eastern Turkey. A layered system of ground-controlled intercept radars, Nike Hercules and Hawk surface-to-air missile batteries, and half a dozen different interceptor types flying from bases across Western Europe. The British had their Lightnings. The French flew Mirages. The Canadians brought their own F-104's north to guard the GI-UK gap. Soviet planners facing this system confronted a problem with no single cause and no single solution. But systems don't have psychological weight. Individual weapons do. Cold War historian David Holloway, writing in 1994, put it this way. The SAM belts and radar networks degraded Soviet confidence gradually, like erosion. The F-104's climb performance broke it suddenly, like a fracture. Soviet aviation planners could route around a missile battery. They could not route around an interceptor that owned the vertical dimension. Holloway spent 11 years in Soviet military archives during the brief window when access opened after 1991. His assessment carries weight because he read the planning documents most Western analysts have only heard described secondhand. The SAMs mattered enormously. The SA-2 that shot down Gary Powers in May 1960 proved surface-to-air missiles could reach altitudes bombers had considered safe. The irony that a Soviet missile validated a capability the Soviets feared from NATO's missiles irritates me more than it should. Both sides drew the same conclusion from Powers. High altitude no longer equaled sanctuary. The Americans learned it over Sverdlovsk. The Soviets had already learned it over Bitburg and Ramstein, watching starfighters claw upward at rates their bomber crews called impossible. Anyway, the pivot toward ICBMs had momentum of its own. Rocket technology matured fast through the late 50s. Korolev's R-7 flew in August 1957, months before the first Starfighter reached Europe. The institutional pressure to fund missiles over bombers predated the F-104's operational deployment by years. Khrushchev personally favored rockets. He liked their deterrent symbolism and their relative cheapness compared to maintaining a global bomber fleet with tanker support and forward staging bases. All true, all documented, and none of it explains the speed of the transition. Soviet military budgets shifted toward the strategic rocket forces faster than any internal advocacy campaign can account for. The timeline compresses between 1959 and 1962 in ways that suggest an external accelerant. Long Range Aviation's budget share dropped by 41% in 3 fiscal years. Bomber crew training billets fell by a third. New production orders for the Tu-95 slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely for the intercontinental strike variant. Something tipped the internal debate from gradual evolution to rapid restructuring, and the something lined up precisely with NATO's Starfighter deployments across the Central Front. The F-104 didn't invent the future. It made the present unbearable enough that the future arrived ahead of schedule. General Lieutenant Johannes Steinhoff slammed the procurement folder shut and looked across the table at his staff. Former Luftwaffe ace, 176 victories in the Second World War, face still carrying the burn scars from a Me-262 crash on takeoff in April 1945. He knew what it meant to strap into an aircraft that could kill you as easily as the enemy. And in the spring of 1960, he recommended that West Germany buy the F-104 anyway. "We need the climb rate," he told the Defense Committee in Bonn. "Everything else we can work around." Steinhoff understood something the politicians didn't. The Starfighter's lethality to its own pilots and its lethality to Soviet strategic planning came from the same source: an absolute, uncompromising commitment to vertical performance that left no margin for anything else. You couldn't sand down the dangerous edges without sanding down the capability. Germany bought 916 of them. Belgium bought 101. The Netherlands, Italy, Denmark, Norway, Greece, Turkey, Japan, Canada, 13 nations in total committed to an aircraft that weighed 19,000 pounds, loaded and carried a combat radius that barely covered 300 miles. Nobody was buying range or payload. They were buying a wall. By 1963, that wall ran unbroken from Bodø in northern Norway to Merdad outside Ankara. A Soviet Tu-95 crew plotting a high-altitude penetration route toward any NATO target in Europe faced Starfighter coverage at every crossing point. The math had become impossible. Scandinavian 104's covered the northern approaches. German, Dutch, and Belgian squadrons locked down the central front, while Italian starfighters guarded the southern Alpine corridors and the Mediterranean. Turkish F-104's sat alert at fields close enough to Soviet Georgia that their radar-painted targets still climbing out of bases in the Caucasus. Each nation operated its own variant, maintained its own readiness standards, flew its own training syllabus. The Italians kept their jets immaculate. The Norwegians flew them in conditions that would have grounded half the Luftwaffe. The operational details varied. The effect didn't. Every corridor and approach vector that Soviet bombers had mapped and rehearsed through the 50s now ran through airspace where something could reach them in minutes, climbing at rates their defensive gunners couldn't track and their electronic countermeasures couldn't jam. The F-104 carried a radar so simple it barely qualified as one. It didn't need sophistication. Ground controllers fed the pilot his intercept heading, and the Sidewinder did the rest from a mile and a half out. 14,000 starfighters rolled off production lines in 4 countries. Lockheed built roughly half. Canadair, Fiat, and a consortium of German, Dutch, and Belgian manufacturers built the rest under license. The bribery scandal that later engulfed Lockheed's European sales campaign, Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, Franz Josef Strauss in Germany, envelopes of cash moving through intermediaries in hotel lobbies, remains one of the ugliest episodes in Cold War defense procurement. The records on that are extensive and damning. But the scandal concerned how NATO bought the Starfighter, not whether the Starfighter worked. It worked. A retired Soviet colonel named Viktor Belenko, the MiG-25 pilot who defected to Japan in 1976, told American debriefers that long-range aviation crews referred to the Central European corridor as the Spike Forest. They meant the Starfighters. Belenko said the phrase carried real fear behind it, not professional respect, but the kind of visceral aversion that changes behavior. Crews volunteered for Arctic rotation to avoid training profiles that simulated penetration of NATO's central sector. Nobody wanted to fly into the spikes, Belenko told his handlers. The quote appears in a DIA debrief summary declassified in 1998. Steinhoff buried 62 pilots during his time overseeing Luftwaffe starfighter operations. 62 men who died in training for a war that their aircraft's existence helped prevent. He attended every funeral he could reach. He stood in rain at gravesides on German hilltops and handed folded flags to women whose husbands had trusted his judgment about that climb rate and that unforgiving silver missile with a man inside it. The flags kept coming. The Soviet bombers didn't. The coffee stain never came out of the concrete at Bitburg. That's what the crew chief's son said in a letter to a veterans forum in 2009, that his father pointed it out every time they visited the old base, even after the 481st deactivated in 1994. Brown ring on gray tarmac, right where he'd been standing the morning the first 104 lit its afterburner and went vertical off the runway. The son's name was David Kessler. His father's name doesn't appear in any official record connected to that morning. Sources conflict on whether the incident David described matches the timeline of starfighter deliveries to the 36th Tactical Fighter Wing or the 479th. The coffee stain, assuming it existed, could have come from anywhere. But the climb, that part checks out. Every quick reaction alert concept NATO runs today descends from the scramble doctrine the starfighter forced into existence. The F-16s and Eurofighter Typhoons sitting alert at Baltic air policing detachments in Estonia and Lithuania follow procedures written in the late 50s for an airplane with 7-foot wings and a death wish. Scramble on signal. Climb immediately. Get above the threat before the threat reaches weapon release parameters. The platforms changed. The airframes got safer, more forgiving, packed with fly-by-wire systems that refuse to let a pilot depart controlled flight even if he tries. The philosophy didn't change. Kelly Johnson's fundamental insight That vertical performance buys time, and time prevents war, still drives how NATO positions interceptors along its eastern boundary. The Typhoon carries a radar that could track a baseball at 40 miles. It hauls twice the weapons load. It costs roughly $85 million per copy. And when the klaxon sounds at Amari Air Base and a Typhoon pilot runs for his jet because a Russian Tu-95 is probing Estonian airspace, he executes essentially the same intercept profile a 104 pilot would have flown out of Hahn in 1961. Get up fast, get there first. The last operational Starfighter retired from Italian Air Force service in October 2004. The Aeronautica Militare held a ceremony at Grazzanese. Pilots who'd flown the jet for decades stood on the flight line in dress uniforms and watched the final two 104's make a low pass over the field. The Italian Starfighters had been the longest serving, the best maintained, and by most accounts, the most trusted and most respected of any operator's fleet. Italy lost 37% of its airframes over 4 decades, a brutal rate by any measure, though Italian pilots will tell you the jet gave back more than it took. Steinhoff died in 1987, the same year Germany finally retired its last Starfighter. He spent his final years writing about air power theory and attending reunions where the crowd got smaller each time. 62 funerals behind him, a burn-scarred face that had looked into more cockpits than most men look into mirrors. No public regret about recommending the F-104 to the Bundestag, but no public satisfaction either. That file, if it exists, stays with his family. The crew chief at Bitburg, David Kessler's father, reportedly applied for a transfer to ground maintenance on the F-4 Phantom when it replaced the Starfighter in the early 70s. His transfer paperwork listed his reason for requesting reassignment. Box 14, Line 3. Prefer aircraft where both crew and pilot survive normal operations. The form went through. Personnel at Bitburg stamped it approved without comment. Whether anyone in the administrative office laughed, the record doesn't say.